Angela to speak a little bit more about the truth of the method and how you see it as related to the political engagement, as you said.
I'm mostly thinking of this concept in the sense of Marxist art historiography, and specifically aesthetic theory. And I mean, ultimately, the question is how does writing relate to reality? And by extent, what's the relationship between reality and representation? How do we reconfigure that relationship in a way that representation itself becomes an intervention into the reality as a tool to change it? So I'm using it in quite an orthodox sense, if I could say. And I mean, I'm also more particularly drawing from the discussion of Mikhail Lifshitz, who was a Soviet aesthetic theorist during Stalin's time and beyond, and his development of the notion of the truth of the method had very much to do with, again, the question of writing itself changing the situation in the ground. So again, it's a very orthodox notion, which also has to do with the relationship between base and superstructure and how the dialectic they function in relation to each other in a dialectical mode. So I'm wondering if we repurpose the question of the truth of the method, maybe not so much I mean, we don't have to stick with orthodox Marxism, but taking into consideration the material conditions of cultural production and reposing the notion of cultural identity into its material basis, perhaps we can elaborate a methodology of historiography and art historiography that can be an intervention into the political constellations and into the everyday life of forming meanings and narratives. But this is a question. I don't have an affirmative proposition. I don't have a guideline yet.
A follow-up question for Angela. I was kind of curious if you could give an example. I mean, you talk about the way in which the historiography was enabled to sort of create a consistent method, and I was wondering if you could give us an example, a particular historical moment or incident that was written in a specific way that illustrates the questions you're talking about? Because I don't really have a sort of sense of the inconsistencies or the sort of lack of method that you were sort of alluding to.
The historical moment I chose was the mid-60s, especially in the framework of the state mandate that came with the charter to formulate a coherent method of historiography, and the discussions that formed around in the committee that I mentioned that was established. And an example is perhaps also. Is one example I have is Mohammed Anis's historiography, in which was formulating attempting to formulate the historiography that had a materialist and class-based approach with progressive socialist tendencies. I mean, but my question that I was asking is that this approach itself was mandated by the state. This is when it became a dominant discourse, and it was in the 60s when it was institutionalized and even bureaucratized in the universities. So my question is whether it's possible to reverse his lesson and to offer a methodology that is very well aware of its own politics, rather than a methodology that articulates itself to the dominant politics.
I understand. Let's take the Muhammad Ali example. Can you sort of, how is that different than the way that the Muhammad Ali narrative was constructed prior to 1960? How does the historiography that's instituted after Nasser vary from the historiography that sort of took place under the establishment of the historical society earlier in the century? For example.
Yeah, honestly, I need to. As I said, I'm not an expert, but from the readings and from the observations that I have, is that Precisely the development, the desire to establish a coherent methodology failed. So that was my issue, because there was never outside of this discussion, these discussions took place within like 5-6 years over how to articulate a collective historiography, but ultimately one wasn't arrived at, in a sense. But for this very desire for me to pose the question of writing itself in relation to the reality of the event was important, even though it failed. And as I mentioned, it became again like this topical treatment of history. So there was never a coherently articulated methodology to begin with, but there were attempts in the 60s. But yeah, I certainly need to do more research to present a more nuanced answer.
Thank you all for your talks. They're really, really fascinating. Tamara, I really liked in your talk the two of the images you had of Hassan's video work. You could actually see your reflection.
Oh yeah.
Taking the photograph.
I was happy with my shiny reflected screen at first. And then
Yeah, but it was really interesting how that kind of paralleled the glass box that Hassan put himself in the first one, that they each had that glass screen in front of them. And I really also liked your point about how Michael Freed's Art and Object came out in 1967. I hadn't realized that. But in terms of this, I'm going to try to figure out how to formulate this. But Claire, you also spoke about the loss of the faith in the framework, and how after 67 there was a questioning of the framework, and additionally this methodology that that Angela was speaking about that kind of falls apart. And so even Michael Freed might actually be an interesting point here, in that perhaps art or art criticism was reflecting on the context of its making more after 1967. Does that make sense? So, Michael Freed talks about art holding a shape, and he really doesn't like the literalist art because it references its own making and its own context. And so I was wondering, I don't know if anyone had any response of, all of your subject matters were quite different, but a response to how that, how the post-1967, why perhaps it led to a wider meditation on the context of thinking, of making, of historiography, these kinds of things.
I guess I understand Freed's writing a little bit differently than you in terms of what theatricality means to him, which I don't think necessarily is so much about context. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I'm understanding you exactly. But I think that there's not necessarily, or like what I was trying to get at was not necessarily that there was a move towards context as the priority after 1967 in arts writing, but more the way in which there was a need to, enforce a kind of common or collective foundation which could be read in any artwork. And what I was interested in was the way that that platform was seen to be located not in some kind of symbolic reference or even a figurative reference, but in what I've been calling the abstract or sub-figurative elements of the painting. So for me, it's not so much about context, but about this deep anxiety over, the loss of self and the attempt to retrieve that and making that kind of the thing that the success or failure of a painting hinges on. But maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, or maybe Tamara should respond to.
I suppose I should justify my use of Freed. I was hoping it would be a kind of irreverent use of Freed. He sets the terms of the debate about abstraction and its value as compared with representation or figurative art. Him and Greenberg set these terms. And they're sort of in the back of my mind when I'm thinking about Hassan's work and the interaction of formal elements and representational elements. So I felt it was necessary to start to historicize those terms, or that binary. But I think I made a point about it, but kind of a a brief point about the politics of Fried and Greenberg's criticism. Greenberg started off writing for the Partisan Review, and he was deeply political, and his earlier stuff on avant-garde and kitsch is excellent and engaged. And then he becomes kind of connoisseurial, and he becomes a spokesperson for the State Department, promoting values of abstraction and American democracy overseas. So the politics of that episode in formalist criticism are kind of left out of the account of formalism in Fried's interpretation in Art and Objective after Greenberg. So he starts to insist on the values of form for form's sake, and presentness as opposed to duration. And to me, implicitly, that's a kind of call for art as an anesthetic, in the face of difficult political circumstances. I think Hassan's work is sort of interesting. He exploits form, but he's obviously concerned with political questions or the capability of artistic form to address political problems. And the framework of the panel, withdrawal, was really the term I was taking seriously. Like, how does Hassan's gesture of withdrawal into form engage content, the content that he's leaving behind? And I might have simplified the matter by sort of locating politics and context on the side of content, and form on the side of this radical possibility for aesthetic experience. But that's sort of how I was using it. So he's politicizing form, or repoliticizing form. I also guess I'm implicitly making an argument that he's a kind of modernist, and I don't know how valid that argument is. But among artist friends in Montreal, this seems to be a kind of intriguing possibility for our practices in the future. I know lots of people who are more and more curious about abstraction and engagement with materials and so on, not necessarily context materials. If that makes them modernists, I guess history moves in cycles. Maybe we need to read Ibn Khaldun, not Marx. Anyway.
But I have a comment for Claire. It seems like that also, like in the history of Western representation since the emergence of abstract art, there has been a need to ground its arbitrariness in some what you call a common platform, be that the figure of the transcendental artist, or like in the case of Egypt, how do you read depth, referential depth in the absolute flatness of painting for painting's sake, in a sense. So it seems like there is a parallel development there, because like on one hand, the abstractionism aims to conceal its arbitrariness in both cases, but like in the case of like Western European and North American abstraction, you have this grounding in the transcendental figure of the artist, whereas in the case of Egypt, you have the grounding in the notion of depth and identity, in a sense. Just a comment.
My question, I think, is fairly quick, and is for Claire. I noticed in the very brief article that you showed to us from, I think it was 1968 or even 67, very quickly after the defeat, there was a key word in addition to the Asala Mu'asir, and that was truth. And this key word of truth was interesting to me, especially given your very evocative, I like this reading of color, line, and shape as ciphers for the relationship of, I think you said individual to a kind of collectivity, perhaps. And I wondered if you had a sense or a reading of where the concept of truth is falling in relation, if it's an opposition, or maybe it collapses the opposition between individual, collectivity, and the color, line, and shape. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. And truth is not that kind of concept and its use is not something I was sort of tracing along the way. But I think for me it's, and you could probably look at the way in which that becomes differentiated, sort of parsed from other related concepts like authenticity, which implies a kind of, rhetoric of truth or something, and becomes more important. And actually, I keep talking about her book, but Jessica Winnegar's book also does discuss it, sort of and she's writing about the 90s, so it's different, but the way that people have recourse to the idea of truth and sincerity in their artwork, and how that differentiates them actually from other very closely related concepts. Somebody else might think like the idea of authenticity, saying, oh, I'm slightly different from these artists who are interested in authenticity, because what is interesting for me is just that I'm sincere about what I'm doing. I mean, I think that there is that history to be sort of looked at. I'm not sure how much I can't really talk to that at this moment. I mean, what I read was it was really sort of more focused on the kind of Asala and Hurriya as key concepts. But I think implied, there's this sort of ball, maybe, like a kind of ball of concepts and ideas and terms that are related and constantly speaking to each other, and I think that their relationships to each other keep shifting at moments, and we tend to, as maybe historians tend to think of them like that Asala is something that we can define and it just progresses, over a course of decades, and so Asala is a concept that's important, but it actually means something differently at almost every moment, I think. And so when somebody says, talks about honesty or something, in this moment, what does that mean? And I'm not sure exactly, but I think that it's positioning here, the fact that it comes up, but it's much subordinate or not as important as something like Asala is significant to what Asala means at that moment. And so, I can't sort of give a definitive answer, but I think you're pointing to something interesting, which is there's this constellation of terms, and they keep sort of shifting really, in a very nuanced way over the course of decades.
These are questions to Angela and Claire. Thank you, first of all. Thank you very much for very captivating presentations. Angela, I know that the span of the presentation is short and you have to say as much as possible. But I'm thinking of the Minister of Culture during the time period that you described, Sarwat Okasha. He was such a complicated character. And when I think of film, which is where I have done most of what I know about Egypt, the fact that Naguib Mahfouz was the head of censorship at some point, and then the Madkour Thabit, a so-called or self-described experimental filmmaker, was also the head of censorship, then he was placed at the National Institute. The fact that Sarwat Okasha instituted the Center for Experimental Cinema in 1970, which was brought to an end in 1973, where filmmakers were just given 16mm phones and told to go through and do whatever they wanted to do, and the perceived necessity for such a center is, I think, adds an interesting maybe hiatus or parenthesis or note to the questions you raised about historiography. I see perfectly what you're saying, and I think that maybe writing about film may have been, illustrates your argument, more so than film. And this is more to Claire. It's interesting and funny that film is always spared this notion of imitation. I mean, it comes up in the 90s, but at that time where Italian neorealism is a big, fat reference, it is not a it is a reference. It is not a monkeying of something, It's interesting. I don't know if it's because film was perceived as a new field of expression, or maybe because it was it stood between art, the seventh art, and the market. And when we think of the films that were made at that time and how they relate to official discourse, how they relate to edification in content versus form, etc. Just putting these things out.
Yeah, that would be a fascinating investigation, because like if we are talking especially about film production, it's also very much connected to power discourse, because from the point of view of, from the aspect of just having resources to produce, and again, like my parallel is the Soviet cinema, which was a utterly bureaucratized state apparatus in a sense, but like within that apparatus there were also filmic practices emerging that were not challenging, that they were not subversive. They're using the same material provided by the official iconography, socialist realism, which was in itself very diverse, but using that same material and doing something else. And maybe like film is spared of this question of imitation because it's inherently imitative in a sense. I don't know if it makes... It's nothing but absolute imitation. In a way, I'm not sure if I'm managing to articulate it, but it would be interesting, absolutely fascinating to look at the relationship between the production of content in film and historiography, like as parallel projects by the state.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say more about this point that you're bringing up, which I think is really important. I mean, why is this huge burden of anxiety so often placed on painting, sculpture, etc., and yet film, literature, seem to be spared that? It's very hard for me to even answer. I'm not sure. I would love to find a text, for example, where someone addresses both of these things, and you can see how they're using these terms to move towards one of these medium and move it away from another. And I mean, it's a fascinating topic. I wish I could address this some more, but I think it's really interesting. What seems to keep coming up today has been the issue of abstraction as as kind of a strategy that's has a very conflicted relationship to the idea of having a relationship to reality, and then abstraction as a way of escaping imitation. So these are the coordinates of what we're talking about. But it's a very good point. Does anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, I'd like to chime in. I think Hassan's work is concerned with the film medium, deeply concerned with the film medium. Like his editorial interventions are severe. He's playing with the medium for sure. He told me when I discussed his early experiences with film that he sort of grew up observing his dad in the editing room, like making the miracle of film happen, making life with cuts, with that kind of an action. So I think he's engaging with the medium, and I don't think I think he's attempting abstraction through the medium of film in a way that doesn't render abstraction an alternative to mimesis. I think the new terms that are relevant for Shen's work with film would be like indexicality and symbolism. I think indexicality replaces mimesis and imitation in a film history that deals with this tension between abstraction and representation. And I don't know what kind of an alternative that is, but I think it's kind of dehumanizing in the first place. Like an indexical trace is sort of author-free or post-humanist. I don't know how you fold that discussion about indexicality in film back into older debates about mimesis and the relationship between imitation, painting, and identity formation, where the hand is much more present. I wonder if describes part of the break between the two histories of film history and history of painting.
Just a short note, like pertaining to your question, why film was spared these accusations of being an imitation, but also like these dominant paradigms of identity discussions, authenticity, sincerity, and maybe perhaps one of the reasons is like that film never really became a bourgeois institution, the same way that art, had its march towards autonomy, towards the liberation, or not the liberation, but towards the individuation of creation and reception at the same time. Whereas like film always, even on like smartphones, it's a kind of a collective medium somehow. But maybe also Bassem would like to comment on edification and film.
There will be a documentary out soon this year, towards the end of the year, called Oil and Sand. And I think it will force us all to think about film as imitation of life and all these discourses. It contains 8mm documents of a film that the royal family was shooting in 1952, where they play roles, where basically they play that they are a sheikhdom in the sand with oil, and British and American people, whatever, the envoys want to grab that oil. The American ambassador of Egypt plays himself. The British ambassador of Egypt plays himself. The royal family play the role of a Saudi or a Khaliji family in the sand. The peasants with arms play the role of rebels. I mean, it's an insane film. It was finished a month before the Free Officers' Coup, and King Farouk burned the film. What remains are these 8mm documents of the films. So I think when you have another conference, we'll put this at some place on a panel and talk about imitation of life and fun.